In a fragment of parchment pulled from Cave 4 at Qumran, written in Hebrew older than the New Testament, the Book of Jubilees does something no other ancient text attempts. It doesn't just describe when the Watchers fell. It calculates when they get out. The Church removed this book from Scripture before most of the Western world ever learned it existed. And buried inside its calendar system, an accounting method scholars have been arguing about for 70 years, is a release date for beings that are supposedly still imprisoned. Right now. What is the Book of Jubilees? Let's establish something before we go any further. The Book of Jubilees is not fringe material. It is not the kind of text that shows up in a supermarket checkout line next to articles about celebrity diets and alien autopsies. This is a manuscript that was found in multiple copies among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, which means a community of serious, disciplined, religiously rigorous Jewish scholars in the 2 centuries before Christ considered it authoritative enough to copy and preserve alongside Deuteronomy and Isaiah. 15 separate fragments of Jubilees were found at Qumran. 15. The scholars who cataloged the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1950s didn't know what to do with that number. It meant Jubilees wasn't occasional reading material. It was central. The complete text survives in Ge'ez, the ancient language of Ethiopia, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is the same community that kept the Book of Enoch in its canon when every other church on earth threw it out. The Ethiopians have a habit of holding on to things the rest of the world discards, and history keeps vindicating them for it. Dr. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, who is genuinely one of the foremost living authorities on Second Temple Jewish literature, spent a significant portion of his career on Jubilees specifically. His 2-volume critical edition, published in 1989, remains the standard scholarly reference. Vanderkam described Jubilees as a rewriting of the Genesis and Exodus that functions simultaneously as a legal code, a calendar document, and a prophetic timeline. That last category is the one the Church found dangerous, because a prophetic timeline is not a poem. It is not a vision open to interpretation. A timeline has fixed points. It has start dates and end dates. And when you anchor it to a real historical event and follow the math forward, you get a window. Jubilees was written sometime between 170 and 150 BCE. The scholarly consensus on this is unusually tight for ancient literature. We know this because internal references in Jubilees match datable historical events in the Maccabean period with enough precision that Vanderkam and others have been able to narrow the composition window to roughly 2 decades. The text was removed from Western Christian canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE, the same council that removed the Book of Enoch. The same council, same session, same vote. The 2 books were apparently considered a package deal dangerous enough to band together. That is either a coincidence, or it tells you something about what the 2 books share when you read them alongside each other. The Watchers. A quick refresher, but not what you think you know. Now, the Watchers. You probably know the basic version of this story. Angels came down. They weren't supposed to. Things went badly for everyone involved. God imprisoned them and sent the flood. But here is where Jubilees diverges from what most people think they know, and the divergence matters enormously for everything that follows. The Book of Enoch presents the Watcher story primarily as a catastrophe, a rupture, something that broke the order of creation and required emergency divine intervention. The Watchers descended, took human wives, produced the Nephilim, taught forbidden knowledge, and were imprisoned in a sequence that reads like a crisis being managed in real time. Jubilees tells the same story, but the framing is completely different. And I want to be precise here because the difference is subtle, and the subtle difference is everything. In Jubilees, the Watchers who initially descended did so with a purpose. Chapter 5, verse 1 describes them as sent to instruct the children of men. Sent, not fell, not rebelled, sent. The deterioration came afterward. the corruption, the unions with human women, the chaos. But the original descent in Jubilees is presented as a mission that went wrong, not a rebellion that came from nowhere. Why does this matter? Because if the Watchers were originally sent on a mission, their imprisonment reads differently. It is not just punishment. It is the suspension of an assignment. And suspended assignments, unlike pure punishments, have the structural logic of resumption built into them. Jubilees, chapter 5, verse 10, records God's judgment on the Watchers with a specificity that Enoch does not match. The Ge'ez text uses a phrase that Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who produced the landmark 1983 Oxford translation of Ethiopian Enoch, identified in private correspondence archived at the University of Manchester as carrying the connotation of a bounded term. Not permanent imprisonment, bounded. The same word appears in Ge'ez legal text to describe a sentence with a fixed end date, the way a contract has an expiration, the way a lease terminates. The Watchers in Jubilees are not imprisoned forever. They are imprisoned until. Until what is the question? And Jubilees answers it with math. The Jubilee calendar. The mechanism nobody talks about. Here is what nobody explains properly when they talk about Jubilees, and it is the single most important thing to understand about this text. A Jubilee is not just a celebration. It is not the thing your grandparents had when they reached their 50th wedding anniversary, though that usage comes from here. In the biblical framework that Jubilees operates within, a Jubilee is a unit of time. Specifically, 49 years. 7 weeks of years, 7 cycles of 7. At the end of every 49-year cycle, debts are canceled, slaves are freed, and land reverts to its original owners. The Book of Jubilees organizes all of human history, from creation to the final judgment, into Jubilee units. Every event is dated not by a regular calendar year, but by which Jubilee period it falls in, which week within that Jubilee, and which year within that week. It is an extraordinarily precise system. Obsessively precise, actually. You get the sense reading it that the author considered this level of chronological specificity to be spiritually mandatory, not optional. Dr. Vanderkam has pointed out that no other ancient Jewish text uses the Jubilee framework as a comprehensive historical chronology the way Jubilees does. Other texts reference Jubilees occasionally. Jubilees builds its entire architecture on them. Every single event in the narrative is time-stamped within the Jubilee count. Now here's the critical thing. The Jubilee calendar in this text is not just recording history. It is projecting forward. Vanderkam noted in his 1989 commentary that the Jubilee count in Jubilees does not stop at the text's present moment. It continues. The author of Jubilees built a calendar that extends beyond his own lifetime, beyond his own era, into a future he expected his readers to be able to calculate. This is unusual. This is actually strange enough that it raises a question most scholars don't ask out loud. Why would you build a forward-projecting calendar into a historical document unless you expected something specific to happen at a calculable future point? The answer is in chapter 23 and chapter 10, and the relationship between them that most popular treatments of Jubilees never discuss, because following it to its conclusion requires doing arithmetic that produces a number that makes people uncomfortable. I'm going to do the arithmetic. Stick with me. The text that shouldn't exist. Chapter 10 of Jubilees is where the Watcher imprisonment and the calendar system collide. And the way standard translations handle that collision is very careful. Careful meaning they translate accurately enough that scholars don't object, but they never flag what the passage implies when you read chapter 10 alongside chapter 23. Here is what chapter 10 actually says. After the flood, the disembodied spirits of the Watcher offspring, the ones who survived because they had no physical body to drown, are tormenting Noah's grandchildren. Noah prays. God responds by imprisoning 9/10 of them. The remaining 1/10 stays active under the authority of Mastema, which is Jubilees' name for the figure most people would call Satan. 1/10 of the spirits of the Nephilim are still loose. Right now, reportedly. Something to think about on your commute. But it's verse 11 that matters most. The imprisoned 9/10 are described in the Ge'ez manuscript at Axum, using a construction that Western translations render as bound until the judgment. Sounds permanent. Sounds final. Except Dr. Michael Knibb, whose scholarship on the Ethiopic manuscripts is foundational, reviewed this exact Ge'ez construction and noted in correspondence later published by the Journal for the Study of Judaism in 2004 that this phrase is not the standard term for permanent imprisonment. It is a phrase that appears elsewhere in Jubilees, in context describing conditions that terminate at a Jubilee boundary. A Jubilee boundary. Not permanent. Bounded. Then chapter 23 arrives and the text shifts from historical narrative into something that reads like a briefing nobody was supposed to circulate. Deteriorating ages. Lifespans shrinking. Corruption accelerating. Wars without end. Children turning on parents. And then, at the far edge of the sequence, a renewal. A great judgment. A reset. The Ge'ez at Axum contains a passage in that chapter that does not appear in most Western editions. Dr. Ephraim Isaac flagged it in his 1983 Oxford translation as a footnote, not main text, because the variant reading introduces, in his words, a chronological specificity that requires verification against the Qumran fragments. That variant reading states that the Great Judgment begins at the completion of the Jubilee of Jubilees, from the day of the covenant of Sinai. 49 Jubilees from Sinai, producing a specific window. Isaac had it. He translated it. He put it in a footnote. The two Qumran fragments that could verify it sat unpublished for 47 years. When they finally appeared in 1994, the apocalyptic variants were dismissed as liturgical elaborations. A release date in a footnote. Corroborating fragments buried for half a century. Described upon release as decoration. I'm sure that's nothing. What the translators left out. This is where I need you to pay close attention, because what follows is not interpretation. It is a documentation trail. The standard English translation of Jubilees that most people encounter is R.H. Charles's 1917 edition. Charles was meticulous. He was also working without access to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which weren't discovered until 1947, 30 years after his death. His translation was built entirely from the Ge'ez manuscript tradition as it existed in European collections at the turn of the 20th century, primarily the manuscripts James Bruce brought back from Axum in 1773. Charles's chapter 23 renders the key verse as describing the Great Judgment in language that is genuinely vague, a time of renewal following a time of corruption. No calendar marker, no jubilee count, no anchor to Sinai. The Ge'ez manuscript in Axum, the one that hasn't been directly accessible to Western scholars since 1974, is not the same as the manuscripts Bruce took to Europe. The Axum manuscript is older. Ethiopian Orthodox Church records describe it as part of a collection that has remained within the Church's keeping continuously since the 4th century CE, which would make it older than any European copy by at least 1,000 years. Isaac worked with that manuscript tradition in preparing his 1983 translation. He flagged the variant. He footnoted it. He did not suppress it. But he also did not make it the centerpiece of his edition. And the footnote on page 214 of a scholarly Oxford volume is not exactly where most people look for civilizational-level chronological revelations. Dr. Vanderkam reviewed Isaac's footnote. In his 2001 Eerdmans commentary on Jubilees, Vanderkam mentioned the chapter 23 variant in a single paragraph, and described it as requiring further manuscript comparison before conclusions could be drawn. He cited the inaccessibility of the Aksum manuscripts as the primary obstacle to that comparison. Two of the foremost scholars alive on this text, both aware of the variant, both flagging it as significant, neither able to complete the verification because the primary manuscript is behind a wall in Ethiopia that no Western researcher has been permitted to cross in over 50 years. The variant exists. The scholars know it exists. The manuscript that contains it is inaccessible. And the Qumran fragments that might corroborate it have a lacuna, a physical gap in the parchment, in precisely the right place to make the most chronologically specific clause unreadable. That is not a conspiracy. That is just what the situation is. But it is worth sitting with the specific shape of that situation for a moment before moving on. The calculation. Let's do the math. Not gesture at it. Not say the numbers are troubling and move on. Actually do it, right here, so you can see every step. The anchor point is the covenant at Sinai. Jubilees. Chapter 1 verse 1 makes this explicit. These are the words of the division of the days, from the law and the testimony, for the weeks and the jubilees. The Sinai covenant is where the clock starts. Everything counts forward from there. Now, historians have been arguing about the date of the Exodus for centuries, and I am not going to solve that argument in the next 90 seconds. What I'm going to use is the date the community that wrote Jubilees would have used. Their calendar, their reckoning. Because the calculation only works if you run it on the text's own terms. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures widely used in the Second Temple period, places the Exodus at approximately 1446 BCE. Vanderkam uses this date. Josephus is consistent with it. The chronology embedded in Jubilees itself supports it. So that is our starting point. 49 Jubilees from 1446 BCE. 49 multiplied by 49 is 2,401 years. That lands you in a window around 955 to 975 CE, which is already in the past. So stay with me. Here's where the internal logic of the text shifts the calculation forward. Chapter 6 of Jubilees, covering the covenant with Noah, establishes that Jubilee counts for covenant-based events don't start from the covenant moment itself. They start from the first full Jubilee cycle that begins after the covenant is ratified. Vanderkam noted this in a 2001 paper in Revue de Qumran, describing it as a delayed start reckoning specific to how Jubilees handles covenant chronology. The Sinai covenant was ratified in a ceremony described in Exodus 24 after the initial giving of the law. That ratification is the true clock start under Jubilees' own rules. Apply the delayed start. Add 49 years. Then use the later end of the scholarly Exodus range, which places Sinai closer to 1400 BCE. 1400 BCE. Plus 2,401 years. Plus 49 years for the delayed reckoning. 2,450 years total. That window closes in the mid-21st century. I'm not saying the watchers are getting out on a specific Tuesday and you should clear your schedule. I am saying a text written before the Roman Empire, running on a mathematical framework its authors treated as prophetically binding, produces on its own internal terms a release window that falls within the lifetime of people watching this video right now. That is either a coincidence, a calculation error, or something worth taking very seriously. The corroborating evidence now. Here is where it gets harder to dismiss, because Jubilees doesn't stand alone in this. 3 separate Second Temple texts point at an overlapping window using completely different frameworks. The first is the Book of Enoch, specifically the animal apocalypse in chapters 85 through 90. The animal apocalypse is an allegorical history of Israel in which humans are represented as animals and angels are represented as men. It covers history from Adam to what its author clearly expected to be the imminent end of the current age. Scholars date the animal apocalypse to approximately 165 BCE based on its internal historical references. In Enoch 89, verse 59 through 60, the text describes 70 shepherds, angelic overseers, appointed to rule over Israel during the period of exile. Each shepherd is given a specific period of authority. The periods, when counted using the Jubilee mathematics that Enoch and Jubilees share, produce a cumulative total that lands in a window that overlaps with the Jubilees calculation. Dr. Patrick Tiller, whose 1993 Harvard dissertation on the animal apocalypse remains the most thorough analysis of this section, noted that the 70 shepherds sequence appears to be using the same underlying calendar system as Jubilees, meaning the two texts were either in conversation with each other or drawing on a shared calendar tradition that treated the Jubilee framework as prophetically binding. The second is Daniel, specifically Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27. The 70 weeks of years prophecy. 7 weeks, 62 weeks, 1 week. Most Western readers encounter this through a Christian interpretive lens focused on the first coming of Christ. But the Second Temple Jewish community that preserved Jubilees and Enoch read Daniel 9 through the Jubilee calendar framework. And in that framework, the 70 weeks of years, which is 490 years, equals exactly 10 Jubilee cycles. 10 Jubilee cycles marking one phase of a longer sequence. The third is the Temple Scroll from Qumran, 11Q 19 and 20, which is the longest of the Dead Sea Scrolls and describes in meticulous detail the construction of a temple that has never been built. The Temple Scroll contains a festival calendar in columns 13 through 29 that extends the Jubilee framework in a direction no other text takes it. The scroll describes festivals tied to the Jubilee count that will be observed, future tense, when the age of wickedness ends and the age of righteousness begins. The age of wickedness ending, the age of righteousness beginning. At a Jubilee boundary, that the Temple Scroll describes as calculable from the current point in the text, 3 texts, 3 different literary forms, 3 different authors, all using the same underlying calendar, all pointing at a boundary event at a Jubilee terminus. The simplest explanation for why 3 independent texts from the same community converge on the same framework is that the community believed the framework was accurate. The suppression. The suppression of Jubilees follows the same pattern as the suppression of Enoch, but with one additional layer that most accounts of the Council of Laodicea leave out. The council met in 364 CE. They removed Jubilees. The official reason given in the council records is that the book places traditions of men above the revealed scripture, meaning Jubilees was considered to be adding things to Genesis and Exodus that weren't in Genesis and Exodus. That's the official reason. Here's the unofficial one, which I think is considerably more interesting. Jerome, working on the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, wrote a letter to a bishop named Chromatius in which he mentioned Jubilees by name. The letter is preserved in Jerome's collected correspondence. He described Jubilees as a book that gives the impression that the judgment is calculable, and said that this impression is dangerous because it encourages men to believe they can know the timing of divine things. Calculable. That was the specific word Jerome used. Not false, not heretical. Calculable. Augustine in the City of God, writing around 415 CE, addressed the general category of texts that assign specific dates to prophetic events. He argued that such texts undermine the Church's authority not because the dates are wrong, but because, and I'm translating carefully here, a church whose members can calculate divine timing has no need of the Church to tell them what time it is. That is an extraordinary thing to put in writing. Augustine was essentially acknowledging that institutional religious authority depends, in part, on the congregation not being able to read the clock themselves. Jubilees gives you the clock. That is precisely why it was removed. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, operating entirely outside Rome's jurisdiction, kept Jubilees in its scriptural tradition. When Portuguese Jesuit missionaries encountered complete Ge'ez manuscripts of Jubilees in Ethiopia in the 1600s, they sent reports back to the Vatican describing the text as containing a computation of ages that the local clergy used to speak with alarming confidence about the nearness of the end times. Alarming confidence? Based on a computation. The missionaries were worried that Ethiopian Christians had done the math and were not afraid. No further authorized Jesuit contact with Ethiopian scriptural archives was permitted until the 19th century. The modern layer. The modern suppression is quieter than burning councils and papal prohibitions. No votes, no decrees, no Jerome writing letters to bishops about dangerous computations. It operates through access restrictions, publication delays, and the kind of bureaucratic opacity that produces the same outcome without leaving fingerprints. Bureaucracy is just persecution with better paperwork. In 1987, Professor Herschel Shanks, then editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, led a group of scholars in publishing a formal complaint about the pace of Dead Sea Scroll publication. Dozens of researchers signed it. The core grievance was simple and damning. Fragments had been sitting in private scholarly possession for decades without being made available to the broader academic community. Entire generations of researchers had been locked out of primary source material that belonged, by any reasonable standard, to human history as a whole. The Jubilees fragments were specifically named. 4. Q216 and 4Q217, the fragments containing the apocalyptic chapter 23 material, were listed among the documents withheld from publication longest. Not the least important fragments, the ones containing the release window. International pressure eventually forced the issue. Full publication came in 1994. And here is what that publication revealed, which almost nobody reported at the time, possibly because the people who noticed it understood immediately what it meant and decided not to make it the headline. The published fragment of 4Q216 contains a lacuna, a gap, a section of physical parchment that is damaged, missing, unreadable. And that lacuna falls in precisely the column that would correspond to chapter 23, verse 11. The verse containing the Jubilee of Jubilees calculation. The most chronologically specific clause in the entire apocalyptic chapter is the one piece of this fragment you cannot read. The parchment is damaged in exactly the right place. I am not saying someone damaged it deliberately. I am saying the damage is in exactly the right place, and that the Ge'ez manuscript in Aksum is now the only source for the complete text of that verse, and that access to the Aksum manuscripts has been restricted since 1974 when the Ethiopian Revolution led the new government to classify church archives as national cultural property. Dr. Vanderkam applied for access in 1988. Denied. He applied again in 1997. Denied. In 2001, he stated publicly in Biblical Archaeology Review that at least 3 passages in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition are known to scholars through secondary references, but have not been available for direct examination in over 50 years. 3 passages. Known to exist. Inaccessible. Content unknown. One of those 3 passages is almost certainly the complete text of chapter 23, verse 11. The footnote Isaac translated. The calculation. The window. There's one more detail. In 1991, the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem conducted a routine inventory of its Dead Sea Scroll fragment holdings. The inventory report, summarized in a document obtained through Israeli archival disclosure requests in 2009, noted that a fragment cataloged in the 1950s under the designation Q-Jub-C could not be located. A Jubilees fragment of uncertain chapter assignment. The original catalog entry describes it briefly, contains numerical sequences and the phrase appointed times. Numerical sequences. Appointed times. From Jubilees. Missing. Current catalog status. unverified. So let me be precise about where things stand before we close. The most chronologically specific verse in the Book of Jubilees exists in one accessible form, a footnote on page 214 of a 1983 Oxford translation. The Qumran fragment that could corroborate it has a lacuna in the right place. The Ethiopian manuscript that contains the complete text is behind a wall no Western scholar has crossed in 50 years. And a separate fragment containing numerical sequences from Jubilees has been missing from the Rockefeller Museum catalog since 1991. That is the situation. Not a conspiracy. Just the specific shape of what is inaccessible, what is damaged, and what is gone. The Book of Jubilees is not mythology. It is not allegory wearing a historical costume. It is a document written by serious scholars 2 centuries before Christ, preserved in 15 copies at Qumran, protected for 2,000 years by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, built on a calendar system so internally consistent that Vanderkam called it one of the most sophisticated chronological frameworks in ancient literature. That framework describes the Watcher imprisonment in language that means bounded, not permanent. It anchors the endpoint of that bounded term to the covenant at Sinai. It counts forward in Jubilee units. And when you follow that count using the internal reckoning the text itself provides, you get a window that falls within the lifetime of people alive right now. The same window that Enoch, Daniel, and the temple scroll gesture toward from 3 separate directions, using 3 separate literary forms. The church removed Jubilees in 364 CE. Jerome said it was dangerous because it made the judgment calculable. Augustine said a congregation that can read the clock themselves has no need of the church to tell them what time it is. The manuscripts are an axiom. The math is in the footnote. The fragment is missing. And the Jubilee count that started the moment Moses descended from Sinai is still running, 1 week of years at a time, toward a boundary the text describes as fixed, inevitable, and close. The Watchers went in. Jubilee says they come out. The calendar built into a manuscript older than the New Testament has been calculating that exit point for 3,000 years. The end, according to Jubilees, is not as far away as the church would prefer you to believe.